Hey, Mr. P here. This video is going to be all about heart anatomy. So we're going to start with a description of kind of some structural components of the heart, and then we're going to kind of navigate through the heart as we trace the route that blood takes on its journey through the heart. So in the last video, if you remember, we talked specifically about vessel anatomy. We talked about the differences and similarities between veins and arteries and capillaries. Talked about the properties that all of them have and possess, and why they have those, and what those specific structures allow them to function, and how they allow them to function, and why they're needed in order to function the way they do. And so we're going to dive into the heart. Let's go. So one of the things we have to understand right at the beginning is that the heart, while it seems like just a basic pump, actually is involved in a pretty complex double circulation task, or a double circulation process. And what that means is the blood actually travels through the heart twice. Okay? There's kind of two separate circulation paths. It's kind of a figure eight, if you will. Now, it doesn't typically look like this in the human body. It's designed this way in this artistic rendition to kind of show you a more, easily separate the two routes. But heart is right in the middle, okay? And one of the biggest things you have to keep in mind when you are labeling the aspects of the heart, again, we're going to go through this in a little more detail, but when you're looking at a diagram of the heart, the right side of the heart is actually going to be on the left side of the diagram, and the left side of the heart is going to be on the right side of the diagram, because the way that diagrams always depict the heart is as if you were looking at the heart in a patient or in a person. So if I was looking at this individual, his left side would actually be what I would perceive as being on the right, and his right side, this being his right hand, would actually be on the left side of him as I perceive it, okay? So we are looking at this diagram, and all heart diagrams will be the same way, and we are looking at this side on our left, but is actually the right side of the physical heart. And likewise, this would be the left side of the heart, even though it's on the right side of the diagram. Okay, so that's one of the things that you have to kind of do right off the bat to kind of calibrate yourself when you're looking at the heart and looking at the structures of the heart. So we've already established that blood is going to pass through the heart twice. That's what double circulation means. The first time it passes through the heart, it's ultimately going to send blood to the lungs, and that's important because the lungs is where all of the gas exchange takes place. The blood then needs to be returned to the heart before it is circulated throughout the body. Now, I know in this diagram it looks like it's circulating out of the heart and to the body, and it all goes down, but you guys know that the heart is kind of in the core. It's right in the middle of our body. Some of that body tissue that is fed by the blood is actually going to be the brain and the neck and the shoulders and upper torso. All of that is actually going to be above the heart, and likewise, most of the body tissue is going to be below the heart. So kind of keep that in mind as well. Now, this net-like structure down here is a capillary bed or a capillary bed, and this structure up here is a capillary bed as well. We've already established in our last video what the purpose of a capillary bed is, and remember, that is to kind of get to the level of the actual tissues, right? So those capillaries get so small, less than 10 microns, so that they can actually get to the level of the cell and can feed nutrients, minerals, vitamins, oxygen, and excrete waste from each individual cell as the cell undergoes its own form, its own metabolism and cell respiration. So if we look at this, again, we are starting on the right atrium, okay, the right side of the heart, which again is on our left, deoxygenated blood. And by the way, this diagram shows a distinction between blue and red. Blue, in this case, is going to be deoxygenated blood, while red is oxygenated blood. That'll make more sense in a minute. But deoxygenated blood, which has low O2, that's what deoxygenated blood means. Low O2, high CO2 is going to return to the heart. All of the blood from our body tissues is going to be low in oxygen because the cells pulled oxygen out, It's going to be very high in CO2 because CO2 was diffused back into the blood. Hemoglobin, again, is going to be carried by all of those red blood cells, which is the enzyme associated with O2 and CO2 transport. But all of this blood that is coming back to the heart through these veins is going to return to the heart and dump into a quadrant known as the right atrium. From the atrium, it's going to go into the right ventricle, okay, on its path to the lungs. At the lungs, the CO2 will be pulled out of the blood and pulled into, I don't know what that was all about. It's going to be pulled into the lungs so that we can exhale and get the CO2 out. At the same time, O2 is going to be coming into our lungs, and oxygen is going to be diffusing into the blood at these capillary beds so that oxygenated blood is returned to the heart, okay? And it's going to be returned to the heart and dump into the left atrium. Okay, now this diagram says the left atrium is down here. This is actually the left ventricle. Atrium are on top, ventricles on bottom. So that is a slight problem or a slight error on this diagram, although the diagram is really good. So O2 is absorbed by the lungs. It's going to be absorbed by those pneumonocytes, those lung cell tissues, and those lung cell tissues are going to diffuse the oxygen into the red blood cells. They're going to be picked up by hemoglobin. They're going to be transported through the pulmonary vein, returned to the left atrium, which is oxygenated blood, high O2, low CO2, and that's going to return to the heart. As soon as that high oxygenated or oxygenated blood returns to the heart, it's going to be pumped out and absorbed by blood tissues, body tissues, and it's going to be pumped to the rest of the body. The red are essentially arteries, right? Or the red vessel in this case, the aorta. It's the biggest artery in the body. It's going to leave the heart. It's going to basically feed all of the body tissues with oxygenated blood. Again, when it gets down here to this capillary bed, the oxygenated blood is going to be diffused into all of your body tissues. It's going to allow your body tissues to absorb the oxygen so that they can undergo cell respiration. Meanwhile, all of the CO2 is going to be diffused back, diffused out of the body tissues into the blood and is therefore going to return to the heart as deoxygenated blood, which is where we started. Okay, so this is kind of the pulmonary circulation. It's from heart to lungs back to heart. That's the first circulation. And then you have the systemic circulation, which is the second circulation, which gives us the double circulation process, where it is heart to body tissue back to heart. Okay? Heart is double circulation. Really important that you understand that. CO2 is collected at this point. I didn't include that waste product from cell respiration. O2 comes in, CO2 goes out, and that deoxygenated blood has to return to the heart so that it can return to the lungs ultimately to exchange those gases. Okay? So, if we dive in on a more in-depth look at the route that the blood is going to take through the heart and within the heart, which is, by the way, a IB skill. Okay, you have to be able to diagram the heart, diagram and label the heart, as well as kind of trace the flow of blood through the heart. We're always going to start right here with the vena cava. The vena cava is a vein. Okay, it is blue. Again, we're keeping with the blue and red theme because the blue is going to represent low oxygen or deoxygenated blood. And red is going to kind of stand in as our oxygenated blood. It's one way that we can help to kind of identify what blood is in this particular portion, as well as where it's coming from and where it's going. So the vena cava is the vein that is bringing deoxygenated blood from the body. So from the body, this blood is going to enter the vena cava and is going to enter ultimately this right atrium. From the right atrium, it's going to go through this valve, okay, which is called the tricuspid valve. This is a valve that sits between the atrium and the ventricle, and valves just like the valves in the veins are designed to disallow blood to move backwards. We always want to ensure that blood is moving in the proper direction, and valves are one way that the heart has adapted to kind of ensure that the heart is able to move the blood in the proper direction. Okay? Now you'll see down here there is a difference between what we call AV valves and SL valves. AV is atrioventricular valve. That's exactly what it sounds like. Okay? Atria and ventricle. The AV valves are the valves between the atria and the ventricle. So this would be an AV valve. So I'll just put it right here. This is a form of AV valve. It's called specifically the tricuspid valve, but it is an atrioventricular valve. So blood is going to come in through the vena cava. It's going to move down this particular vessel and dump into or fill up the right atrium. The blood is then going to go through the tricuspid valve and is going to enter the right ventricle. Once the blood is in the right ventricle, the ventricle is going to contract. Notice that the walls, the muscular walls, are substantially thicker on the ventricles than they are up here on the atrium, and that's by design because the ventricles are actually the part of the heart that contracts. This down here is the area that actually squeezes, not the ventricle or not the atrium. Okay? Atrials don't contract, the ventricles do contract. When the blood moves into the right ventricle, the ventricle is going to contract, closing this valve, ensuring that the blood is sent up this particular vessel, moving through the pulmonary valve, which is not an AV valve. That would be the first SL valve, semilunar valve. Okay? The semilunar valves are the valves that are in the arteries leaving the heart. This one closes, this one opens, the ventricle contracts, pushes the blood into this artery, and once it goes into that artery, it's going to continue to go through the pulmonary arteries, which head to the lungs. What are they going to do with the lungs? They're going to do, they're going to do all of the gas exchange, okay? CO2, because remember this is low oxygenated or deoxygenated blood. CO2 is going to diffuse out into the lungs, out of the blood, into the lungs. O2 is going to diffuse into the blood. All of that occurs at the pneumonocytes. That's going to be actually in the lungs. That's another future video. We'll get into all of the gas exchange stuff. And once we oxygenate the blood, okay, so here, oxygenate. Once we oxygenate the blood, which is the role of the lungs, the blood is going to return back to the pulmonary vein. Okay, pulmonary artery takes it to the lungs. Pulmonary veins are going to return the oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the heart. Again, now we're switching to red. So that blood that is now oxygenated returns to the heart through the pulmonary veins and will fill up this left atrium. Once the blood enters the left atrium, it's going to move through the bicuspid valve, which is the second AV valve, atrioventricular valve, again because it is a valve between the atrium and ventricle. Moving from the atria into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will then contract, physically squeeze, moving the blood up through the aortic valve, which is an SL valve, semilunar valve, because it is in the artery leaving the heart. And once the blood moves through the aortic valve into the aorta, it is physically going to be sent through a series of forks that branch and take that oxygenated blood to the body. From there, the O2 will be able to diffuse into all of our tissues, which will allow for cell respiration, which is the process that produces ATP and allows us to physically produce energy and keep the tissue cells alive. Okay? Make sure you bring questions to class if you have them. Otherwise, that's where we're going to end it. Okay? That is the trip through the heart. Pretty simple, but can be fairly complex at the same time. So, see ya.